I recently spent some time making this looping short of a bouncing ball that plays the theme from Swan Lake. It's the kind of one-off animation project that, these days, I tend to code with the help of an AI tool, in this case, Claude. I'm a bit ambivalent about this because it feels kind of like I'm feeding a beast that's helping to destroy society. But on the other hand, I just really wanted to see this ball bounce out the theme to Swan Lake, and with 2 kids bootstrapping a YouTube channel all on my own, I'll take what help I can get. But why am I making a video about it? Well, I saw this post on Mastodon recently that struck me as a bit over the top. Mastodon, or at least the corners of it that I hang out on, definitely skews anti-AI, and this post was no exception. The writer takes issue with the word hallucinate, because that suggests that these models are going into and out of contact with reality, whereas actually these models don't have direct contact with reality at all. They don't think, they just take on the superficial shape of thinking and reasoning. Ultimately, it's all just probabilistic Mad Libs, no better than a stopped clock that occasionally displays the correct time by chance. A fair amount of this actually resonated with me, especially in the context of a sometimes unhinged AI hype cycle, with people like Ray Kurzweil saying that the singularity is near, and that ChatGPT's poetry, while not yet up to the standard of the best human poets, will surely get there in just a few years. I'll let you be the judge of that. But still, the stopped clock metaphor felt magnificently overstated. I mean, a stopped clock is probably reasonably accurate about 1% of the time. But with the right kind of question, these AI assistants are starting to feel accurate like 90% of the time. And sure, that other 10% of the time can be really problematic. But is certainty really a reasonable expectation ever? After all, even a working clock can unexpectedly run out of batteries. So to me, the more relevant question is, when, if at all, are these tools useful? And I thought a good case study for this might be to walk you through the process of writing this bouncing ball animation, with the help of Claude and, at times, my own brain. I think this kind of project is a pretty good use case for AI assistants. The code doesn't have to be perfect, it's not going to live for decades inside of some larger complex system, and it's not making life or death decisions or putting anyone out of a job. It's just a fun little musical animation, and if the code works to make that animation, that's all that really matters. So I started out by asking Claude to create an animation of a bouncing ball that plays a melody. I gave it a few pitches and durations and asked it to place platforms so that the X position roughly correlates to time and the Y position to pitch. The ball should then bounce using realistic physics in such a way that it hits the exact center of each platform at the exact right time. And here's what Claude came up with. Now, to be fair, looking back at my prompt, I didn't do a great job explaining what I was after. And that's in part because I didn't totally understand what I was after yet, which is actually kind of a significant point here. My experience of writing, whether it's words or code, is that I tend to figure out what I'm trying to say through the process of writing it. Writing isn't just a process of putting pre-existing thoughts into words. Often it's part of the process that generates those thoughts in the first place. Do AI tools take that away from us? Am I getting derailed by philosophical concerns way too early in this demonstration? Well, anyway, I mentioned to Claude that the ball didn't so much bounce as fall through the floor, and it responded with a revised version that blew the first version out of the water. I mean, that's twice as many platforms correctly hit, a 100% productivity increase. But yeah, I eventually realized that, partly because of how I framed the question, the approach Claude was taking was going to be hard to get right. It was running a physics simulation, integrating the ball velocity over time, detecting platform collisions, and then attempting to calculate the exact right launch velocity to send it to the next platform at the exact right time. All of this was just a little bit too finicky, and we hadn't even started dealing with the cylindrical nature of the space yet. So I thought about it and realized that there must be an easier way. Projectiles follow parabolic arcs, right? Couldn't I just calculate a parabolic arc that goes from one point to another? Well, I decided to investigate in Desmos, and I found a way to get a parabolic arc between 2 points where I could freely vary the points and the curvature of the parabola. But there was a problem. The same curvature could create a low or a high bounce depending on how far apart the points are. What I really wanted to control was the height of the bounce. I tried to do this by defining curvature in terms of the desired bounce height, but ended up with a situation where there was a circular dependency between the variables, and I wasn't sure how to proceed. So naturally, I asked Claude, and Claude gave me a solution. But when I plugged it into Desmos, I saw that the peak of the parabola was ending up outside of the 2 points, which is obviously not great for my use case. So I asked Claude to make sure it peaks between points A and B, and for some reason, no matter how I asked, it only ever gave me solutions for the case in which the heights of the 2 points were the same, which was effectively useless. So again, I regrouped and tried to think of a different way to get the result I wanted. And I realized that it would just be easier, instead of trying to hit an exact peak height, to just give it a third guiding point based on the rough height that I wanted to reach. Since 3 points fully determines a parabola, the solution should be easy to find. And the discrepancy between the height of the guiding point and the maximum height reached by the parabola wouldn't be too significant. Now, I didn't really feel like working out the equation of the parabola that goes through 3 points by hand, but luckily Claude had me covered. I tried the result in Desmos, and it clearly worked, so then I asked Claude to rewrite that as a Python function. Boom. Looks great. Anyway, I say all of this to point out one of the basic limitations of AI as it currently exists, which is that to get useful answers, you have to ask good questions. And in my experience, to ask the right questions, you need expertise in math, in coding, or in whatever subject you're trying to use it for. Okay, so far Claude has been sort of helpful. It's sped up my process a bit, but it's hardly been a magic bullet. This next step, though, is where it really shined. For my video, I knew I needed a vertical viewport that looks in on a cylindrical world, where the x-axis wraps around horizontally. I wanted certain things to be easily adjustable, and for it to draw a few small objects within that world. To test the horizontal wrapping, I asked it to make it possible to drag the viewport back and forth. Well, the result was impressive. The code looked well organized, in a similar way to how I might do it myself. And check out the result. Horizontal wrapping works great, and it even drew a little progress bar, which was super helpful for debugging. I can safely say that this step saved me a lot of time. And to be honest, I wasn't too surprised that Claude shined here, because this is the kind of problem many people have solved many times over. In the old days, I might have pieced together some stuff from Stack Overflow, but Claude allowed me to get something specifically tailored to my exact needs right off the bat. So what next? Well, first I asked it to normalize the coordinate system, since that would make it easier for me to position the platforms later. And then it was time to start animating by adding a move to function. And this is where it started to get a little funky. First, there was a glitch where a scrap of code was accidentally inserted at the beginning, but that was easy to fix. The bigger issue was that in the main event loop, it was calling both draw and update on the objects, but the actual code for the objects only had an update function. Looking more closely, that function did both update and draw the objects, but still, it was broken. I asked it to fix these issues and do a couple other refactors while it was at it, and while it did some of what I asked, it still didn't create a separate draw function. In the end, I just had to manually fix that issue. And for me, that wasn't a big deal. But this is one of those situations where you do kind of feel like you're dealing with a Mad Lib, not a thinking, reasoning agent. And if I weren't a thinking, reasoning agent myself, and a coder, this would have been a dead end. Still, check out the results. I had it write the code so that you could either move in a straight line or follow an arbitrary motion function, in this example, a circle. This meant that it would be easy to incorporate the parabolic bounce function that we figured out earlier. So I went ahead and pasted in that function, and also asked Claude to restructure the code as 2 files, the core cylindrical engine model, and a script that uses that engine to make a specific scene. This kind of refactoring is something that I generally find AI tools very convenient for, although you do have to be careful to double check their work. So far, so good. The main script looked clean, and when I ran it, I had a bouncing ball. But when I tried to chain 3 of those bounces together using callback functions, I ran into a mysterious bug. Only 2 of the bounces happened. I tried asking Claude why it was failing to do the final bounce, but the responses it gave were pretty useless. In the fashion of a typical AI hallucination, they sounded reasonable, but made no sense when you really thought about it. I eventually tracked down the issue, and it turned out that the problem wasn't that it failed to do the final bounce in a chain, but rather that it only ever did 2 bounces, no matter what. And this was because it was unintentionally overwriting the callback function of the callback function after it was set. So once again, garbage in, garbage out. Because I misunderstood the bug, I was leading Claude down the wrong path and getting nonsense in response. By the way, out of curiosity, while making this video, I tried making the prompt more specific. First by rewording it as just the first 2 bounces, and then by trying to point it more specifically to the exact spot where the bug occurred. And it was only when I told it the exact function to look at that Claude actually found the bug. So now I had the ability to chain together as many bounces as I wanted. From there, I briefly tried to get Claude to refactor the whole animation system, but it kept doing this weird thing where it would write an animation class but never use it, and keep everything else the same. In general, I've noticed that it tends to be hesitant to remove old code, which might be a byproduct of people complaining that AI systems change things that they don't want to change. Anyway, I gave up on that refactor and decided to forge ahead with the code as it was, asking Claude to add a change color function, which would smoothly change the color of an object over a given length of time. I wanted to use this to highlight the ball and the platforms. This is a fairly straightforward but kind of boring task that ordinarily I would have mildly dreaded. Instead, with Claude, it got written quickly and painlessly, and looking through the code, it did more or less what I would have done. Similarly, I noticed that the drawRect function that it initially wrote only drew squares, which was not ideal for my distinctly rectangular platforms. But again, Claude easily took care of the drudgery of refactoring it. Although, to be fair, I would never have written this function this way in the first place, since I knew I had to do platforms. With that out of the way, it was time to create the platforms. This involved taking an array of notes and durations and mapping them to a series of rectangles whose height was based on pitch and whose horizontal placement was based on the time since the start of the melody, wrapping around to the beginning every 12 beats. And from my experience, this felt like a task that I should really do by hand. See, whenever I use an AI coding tool, or really any kind of large language model, I always first ask myself, how well is this task probably represented in the dataset? Which is to say, as much of the internet as they could possibly scrape, disregarding all ethical and copyright considerations. So far, everything I've asked Claude to do would have been pretty well represented. Pygame is a super popular Python library, and I'm sure plenty of people have coded cylindrical game engines. But when you add music to the mix, you're asking the LLM to interpolate into a space where it's a little bit shaky. You can see a lot of examples of this in my series of videos trying to get ChatGPT to compose music. It'll tend to do things that show that it doesn't really understand how to integrate these two domains of knowledge. Anyway, point is, I wrote some code by hand to place the platforms where I wanted them. I dragged it around, and it looked right. Having laid this groundwork, I then asked Claude to use everything we'd created to add the bouncing ball. And it was more or less successful, though it initially made a boneheaded mistake with the timing that suggested it didn't really get what we were doing. Next, I realized that it would be helpful to separate the voices of the canon visually by having the platforms gradually change color as they transition from the top voice to the bottom voice. Again, this is just the kind of drudgery that Claude excels at. Finally, I added the music with a few calls to my Scamp library, and here was the result. So look, I could go on and tell you how Claude was super helpful with adding the code for offline rendering of a video, but bad with debugging timing issues that arose from the fixed frame rate of the video versus the variable frame rate we had been using. But at this point, I think you get the idea. In my experience, Claude, and AI coding tools more generally, are great at things that you could do yourself but that are kind of obvious and repetitive, solving problems in very well-charted territory in a way which is tailored to your specific use case, fixing bugs and careless errors that are localized to a specific region of code, and also sometimes acting as a consultant or tutor when it comes to understanding something that I've heard about but don't fully understand. Although you do have to be careful to ask for sources and double check. On the other hand, Claude is not so great at coming up with creative ideas or interesting questions, architecting and understanding the interconnections of a complex codebase, working between the cracks of its expertise, or solving more subtle bugs that are harder to localize. Again, a lot of this just comes from the fact that LLMs are like giant interpolation machines. And on the one hand, the super high-dimensional nature of that interpolation is kind of magical. Like, I still can't quite get over the fact that it took this text and made this working prototype. But on the other hand, however much they may look like they're writing decent poetry to a person who never really reads poetry, I think the truth is that they're constitutionally incapable of true understanding and true creativity. So where does that leave us with this whole AI code assistant thing? Well, with some of the surface wrinkles, like writing an animation class and then never using it, I think those will work themselves out over time. But the more basic fact of needing to have knowledge yourself in order to get significant value out of these tools, I don't think that's going away. I think if you want to do something novel using AI tools, you have to supply the novelty yourself. And the more novel the thing you're trying to do, the more you're going to need to be there guiding the process. By the way, this poem at the end, I generated it by giving ChatGPT the script of this video and asking it to write a poem about it in the style of a talented contemporary poet. And sure, a lot of it is trash, but it feels like some parts of it are genuinely kind of good, or at least speaking to something real. And I think that's because I put a lot of thought and energy into this script. I chose my words carefully, I edited and rewrote parts of it, and so because I gave ChatGPT something meaningful, aspects of that meaning came back to me through the poetry. Anyway, if you want to check the poem out for yourself, and maybe leave a comment about which parts made you cringe and which parts brought you to tears, I put a recording of myself reciting it on my bonus channel.